Okay. Here's what we're going to cover today. Alerts and reports. Trying to be proactive to see the critical data regarding timesheets. We're going to talk about timesheet periods. Timesheet grid fields. There's actually some new information there that I think is pretty interesting. Tracking overtime or shift work. We're going to get into how you can do that in OpenAir, what the limitations are. The time entry tab. There are some per project settings that I see a lot of people are not taking advantage of. Not necessarily useful for everyone, but definitely good to know about. We're going to go through the approval settings, and then we're going to talk about overlapping timesheets and timesheet adjustments. So let's jump right in with alerts and reports. So late timesheets alerts is probably one of the most commonly used features that I see almost every company using that we work with. But what I do see an opportunity for improvement by a lot of people is setting them up by time zone. So if you're a global organization, or even if you're just in the US and you're operating in different time zones, you can't really do it by user very well, but you can try to simulate time zones just by department. So the idea is if you have somebody on the East Coast versus somebody on the West Coast, or maybe in different places in the country, ideally they should get their late timesheet alert at a reasonable hour based on when their timesheet is actually due. So if you have a global organization, you don't want necessarily everybody to get an alert at 9 a.m. Eastern time, because it's 6 a.m. in the West Coast, and obviously it's even worse and further off for people in other regions. So as much as possible, it's not entirely possible to do it completely, but if you can set up departments that reflect general time zones or even regions, then you can have different alerts for each of those departments, so that when that alert goes out, everybody in that department gets it at a particular time. And then another reminder, if you're not using it, the timesheet required checkbox on users, you can add that as a control. So in other words, you're saying, we only want to send these alerts to people if their user record has that checkbox checked to require a timesheet. That's a nice way to keep any executives that might have OpenAir access but aren't required to enter timesheets, or any operations people that might not enter timesheets, to leave them out of that whole alert thing. Check the people who should be getting alerts, uncheck the people who should not. There's a daily time entry alert that I don't see most people using, but it actually can be really useful if you're doing any kind of forecasting that includes worked hours. So if you've already established as your operational process that people need to enter their time daily, because that daily time refreshes your forecast that you might run throughout the week, you kind of want to see what are the actuals so far this week combined with whatever our plan is, whether it's assigned hours or booked hours into the future. If that's important for you, then you can establish a daily time entry alert, which will basically notify somebody saying, hey, there's no time on your timesheet for yesterday. You need to get that in. So if you're not already using or expecting daily time entry, you want to stay away from this because it's obviously overkill to get a daily alert. But if you've already established this is the expectation, this is a good way to help enforce that. And timesheet rules. Let me go ahead and take a look. I'm going to try to share my browser with you and see if you can see it. And Deborah, can you let me know, are you able to see my browser? I've got my colleague here on Instant Messenger who can just let me know. Hopefully that's showing up for everybody. Let me jump over to timesheet settings. Here we go. So these are the timesheet rules. If you're not really familiar, or maybe you haven't really looked at them since you first implemented, I see that in a lot of cases. Usually when people are implementing, they don't really know necessarily what should be set here, and a lot of times people kind of don't revisit this ever. So it's worth a look if you haven't taken a look in a while just to see what's set up here. And specifically the one I want to point out is this first one, minimum number of hours required on the timesheet. A lot of people will do fixed hours. So they'll say, you know what, you have to have at least 40 hours on your timesheet. However, for some companies that have different work schedules, maybe you have work schedules for part-time employees or part-time contractors with a 30-hour work schedule, for example, or a 20-hour work schedule. Well, it's really going to mess those people up if you have a rule that says you have to have at least 40 hours entered. So rather than do that, I like to see percent of work schedule 100%. And you can choose whether you just want to warn people or produce an error. I will tell you, though, if you're using the warning, this itself can cause a lot of problems because I've seen it time and time again where the system will, you'll submit your timesheet, it'll have less than 100% of your schedule, and you click Submit, and the first screen you see is warning your timesheet has less than 100% of your work schedule. And then there's this little link that's easy to miss that says click here to continue. Well, a lot of people just don't really pay attention and they don't click to continue. So the warning ends up producing a lot of open timesheets people swear up and down they've submitted, but they actually aren't submitted all the way. So if this is actually part of your process and it's important, I would say either just do an error because it's much more clear to the end user, or just not use this enforcement at all. So just be careful on the warning there. Okay. Advanced reporting. So I know that probably every single person listening has some version of the timesheet status report. It's an advanced report. There are lots of different ways to set this up. Usually you end up running a report that says, show me all the missing timesheets. So any timesheet that has any status except approved. So you're just looking at exceptions. If you're not doing that already, I recommend you do that. It becomes really cluttered to look at all timesheets regardless of status, including approved. Really cleans it up if you're not showing the approved timesheets. So using this in conjunction with the late timesheet alert for individual, and then if you schedule this report, set up a different report for each manager and schedule it to them weekly. So each manager gets a report in their inbox once a week that says, here's everybody on your team that has a timesheet other than approved. That's a really clean way to manage it both from a user perspective as well as from managers to try to minimize the amount of intervention that you're having to do from the operations side or finance side. And then a big request that I see a lot. So enforcing timesheets is probably one of the most common questions that we get. It's one of the common frustrations just in general. It's partly a system challenge, but it's mostly really a business process challenge. How do you make sure that everybody gets their timesheets in on time? And I've heard lots of different ways to do this, from including it as part of people's bonuses. I've actually done that before in other companies. Or whether you just want to run a report and review it with people as part of their performance review, or whether you just want to pick up the phone and get on people's case as needed. Every company is different, obviously, but there is a report that you can run that a lot of people don't know about that will show you historically whether timesheets were submitted after the deadline. So I'm going to jump into the browser and show you what I've done in a few cases that can sometimes work for people. So the idea is you start with a custom calculation. And let me see, I think I have it submitted here. Essentially, you're looking for a date diff field. And this is under Global Settings, Custom Calculations, and Custom Detail fields. And this is it. I've created one here. It's called Submitted Delay. And all this does is it just calculates the difference in terms of days between the timesheet end date and the date submitted. Now, this is my sandbox, so I have it set it up so that Saturday is always the timesheet end date. So I'm calculating the difference between Saturday and Monday. So in this example, Monday timesheets are due. It doesn't really do it by the hour, so I can't see whether they submitted it, Monday after 9 a.m. or something like that. But it does give me a good historical report that says how many days after the end date was their timesheet submitted. And then I can run a timesheet detail report that looks like this. And then I can just sort by this difference here. So in this case, Robert August, for the timesheet starting date, 3/25, there were 5 days between the end of the timesheet, which was Saturday, and the day he submitted it. And I've put here greater than 2 is late. So I know here's a late timesheet. All these timesheets were submitted late if it's 2 or greater, or if it's greater than 2. For anything that's 2 or less, I don't know for sure what time on Monday they submitted it. I just know that they submitted it on a Monday. So this is a good way. Actually, at my last company, we would run these reports historically to say, for the entire quarter, how many of your timesheets were submitted at least a day late? And we would ding people's bonuses for that. So if that's something that's useful, if you want to kind of back up and see how that works, you can take another look at the recorded webinar. But again, it's just a custom detail field with a date diff, and then use these 2 values. And you can call it whatever you like. Just keep in mind you can only use this in a timesheet detail report. It's not going to work in a summary report as well. Okay, timesheet periods. So most companies that we work with end up doing a weekly timesheet. You enter your time either Sunday through Saturday or Monday through Sunday, something like that. Occasionally, I know we've worked with a few companies that will do semi-monthly timesheets or even monthly timesheets. It just means that your timesheet grid when you enter it is a lot bigger. So there's more days to enter. The challenge is, let's say you're doing weekly timesheets and you acquire a company that wants to do semi-monthly timesheets. If you want to accommodate both of those time periods, you can. You can't really do it by department or country level, but you can do it by user to basically get you there. There's an internal switch that will allow you to do this. You have to request it from support, and just allows you to determine the timesheet time period at the user level. So you still have to go through each user for each group and determine it based on what their timesheet range should be, but it does work. It doesn't affect your reporting. So a lot of people are worried, well, how do I tell if timesheets are late or worked time, approved time? There is definitely a timing challenge of, if I want to see all the approved time every Friday, you're not necessarily going to get it for those that have semi-monthly timesheets. However, at the end of the month, the data is stored on a daily level, so you'll still be able to see an accurate picture of time entered. So it's really more of a timing challenge than a historical reporting challenge. Another feature I see used every once in a while, not really much for timesheets, but it is possible to set open periods. So you basically are restricting date ranges that people can enter time for. So the idea is, especially with contractors, if your contract with your subcontractor states that we won't pay you for time if it's entered more than, say, a month late or 2 months late, because at that point it becomes really challenging to bill your customer, in some cases impossible, so you don't want to incur the cost. If that's part of your process and you want to be able to enforce that, keep in mind it starts out as a global restriction, and it's a little bit tricky to manage if you want to say only these users have restricted time periods, but everybody else can enter time at any time. It's possible, but it's definitely challenging to administer. But the idea is you can set at a global level the weekly range, or if you're doing monthly timesheets, the monthly range that is eligible to have time entered in against it. And then every week you would update that and then just delete a historical week range and add a new week into the future. So you kind of keep that cycle going forward. So if they go to enter a timesheet and they try to enter a date, it just won't be available for them to enter it if it's older than whatever you've specified. This is, I see this most commonly used on expense reports, not so much timesheets. So a lot of companies will have policies that we won't reimburse you if an expense report is so many days old or so many months old. So you can enforce the same thing for expense reports, and that's where I see this used most commonly, but it is possible to do it for timesheets as well. All right, let's talk about timesheet grid fields. So picture a timesheet, you're entering time. You have a certain number of fields that you can populate within that timesheet grid. The first one that is optional is TimeType. Now, if you're not using TimeType, a lot of you are using it already, but if you're not, this is what it does. You can use it for anything that you'd like. It's a drop-down field. You can define whichever values you like. You can filter it in your time billing rule filters. And essentially, every time entry that gets entered inherits this value. So most commonly we see the scenarios of like a billable, non-billable designation. You can actually use this to control whether the time actually gets processed by a billing rule. So if somebody enters their time, they mark their time type as billable. The time billing rule says any time that's marked billable in the time type should be billed. Then you're allowing the user to control which of their time actually is eligible to be passed on in an invoice. Now, for some businesses, that makes sense. It really is the user who knows better than anyone else. If not, it's not a good way to use it. If you want that controlled somewhere else, don't use TimeType for that. You can use it for overtime, which I'm going to dig into in greater detail in a couple slides. You can use it for on-site versus remote. This is actually how we use it internally at TopStep. So for tax purposes, we want to tell not just where people worked, but specifically whether the time that they worked was on-site or remote. Because if it's remote, we don't really need to report that time for tax purposes as revenue earned in that location, say project location, for example. But if the time was on-site, that's the time that we want to collect and report for tax purposes, so that's how we use it. I see a lot of people using this for utilization. You might have 4 or 5 categories of utilized time. So people have like utilized, non-utilized, billable, utilized, billable, non-utilized, all kinds of categories like that. I see it used for that too. And then you can run reports based on, let me show the groups of everybody's time based on these time categories. The other nice thing about TimeType is you can restrict in filter sets which time types are visible to which users. So if you have regional groups where they have different uses of time types, let's say your UK group only needs to use 2 of the total of 5 time types available, you can restrict the UK users in their filter set so when they go to enter their timesheet, they only see 2 of the possible time type selections, whereas other users would see all 5. And then, of course, you can subtotal these on summary reports. There's a thing called Payroll Type that I see a lot of people not taking advantage of. But let's say you're using TimeType already for something like billable, non-billable, but you have this other need to also record some other category of that time. So it could be a particular activity type, like I did this type of work, project management, if you're not already tracking that at the task level. Maybe you want to use billable with TimeType, but you also like the idea of tracking on-site versus remote. Payroll Type works essentially the same way as TimeType. You can rename it to whatever you'd like. But again, once you enable it, it just becomes a new drop-down field available in the timesheet grid. So you can use it as work location. That's actually how we use it. I see this used as a contractor role. So some companies will use a shared login, just a single login to enter the time for their subcontractors. And then they'll use this payroll type field to track what activity the contractor was actually doing. Especially handy if you need to provide these types of reports to see where contractor hours are going, or if you pay a different rate based on the activity of the contractor. I don't think it's a good solution for using as contractor name because the list will just grow infinitely. It's not really scalable for that. So you just go into the standard timesheet settings, other settings, and you can enable it and just start adding payroll type selections, and then they start showing up. Now, back to TimeType, there's some extra benefits to using TimeType as opposed to payroll type. So I just got through saying it's essentially the same thing, but there are some differences. If you want to limit time type by project or by task, you can do that, but you can't do it with Payroll Type. So if you say, on this particular project, I don't want people to be able to enter the time type of billable because it's an internal project, for example. You can do that. It's an internal switch. Once you enable it, you get this filter that shows up. You can see on the slide it says time types allowed and time entry. You can control that either at the project level or the task level. It's just, again, whichever internal switch you request. And then once you click on that link, you get this little pop-up that says, okay, of all of the available time types, which ones should be available when somebody enters time against this project or task? So here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the differences between time type and payroll type. The top three lines there, you can rename them both. They're both available in timesheets, or you can make them available. You can have default values when people create a new timesheet, so that anytime you create a new timesheet, it can be pre-populated with whatever value they select. The difference is, though, payroll type is significantly limited because you can't filter billing rules based on it. You cannot limit access in filter sets, and you cannot limit the available selections in projects or tasks. So if you're just new and you're thinking about using both of these or one or the other, think about whether the value should be able to be limited in filter sets, projects, and billing rules. And that should clue you into which one you should use. In some cases, I've actually transitioned. They're already using time type, but they have this new requirement. So we'll actually take all their time type values, shift them over to payroll type, and then use time type for something new because of its flexibility. So let's say you're in the situation where actually, okay, I'm using these two, but now I've got this other category yet again that I want to report on. Well, what can you do there? Well, if you're not using it already for another purpose, you can also use service in the same way. That's a big if, because most people are already using service for integration purposes, for all their transactions created from time entries, like billing transactions and charges. That ends up getting passed over to your financial system, and you want that to inherit some kind of service so you can track your income categories, et cetera. If you're not already doing that, you can use service in the exact same way time type and payroll type work. You can display it on the timesheet grid. You can have the user select it, and it works just like a time type in that case. So you can make it available in billing rule filters, filter sets, and you can limit it by project or task. So there's really no difference if you decide to use it that way. Okay, let's talk about overtime. OpenAir does not calculate overtime. It just doesn't. It wasn't built for that. Usually, when people enter their timesheet, you have somebody in HR who's, if you have to pay overtime, they have their own calculation outside the system to determine it. There's so many different laws depending on where the person works, the nature of their job, whether they qualify or they don't. It's usually an HR function that's performed external to OpenAir, so they just didn't build it in the system. But I have actually come across a scenario where one of my customers needed to track this for their subcontractors. So they had a lot of contractors that needed to report whether their time was regular time, overtime, or double time, so that they could pay different rates based on that. And they wanted to be able to report what is our cost in OpenAir based on whether our contractors worked overtime or not. So in this case, I ended up using TimeType because they weren't using it for anything else already. I set up filter sets. So we had an overtime filter set and a non-overtime filter set. So any subcontractors who qualified for overtime got the overtime filter set, and that meant that they could view time types. There were 3 time types: regular hours, overtime, double time. Anyone who didn't qualify for OT, their filter set just had no access to time type. So when they actually went to enter their timesheets, there's not even a field called time type because it's restricted by their filter set. And then we created a few custom calculations that would take the timesheet cost And where the time type is overtime, just multiply it by 1.5. Where it's double time, multiply it by 2. And then they're able to run a report that actually adds up all those 3 levels of cost into one value. And for anybody who doesn't have a time type, it's just actual cost. So they can see what was our cost last month, including overtime, and it works really well for them. So that's about the only solution that I've seen in the system for overtime. If you want to track shift work, you can do the same thing. So I know some companies want to track whether the hours are regular business hours or after hours or weekend hours. Again, you can do the same thing. The caveat is you're depending on the user to enter accurate data, right? So if a contractor entered all of their time as overtime or double time, you have to catch that in your approval process, but the system can't evaluate that for you. Okay, the time entry tab. Hopefully all of you have the time entry tab enabled. If you don't, that's my #1 recommendation for you. I've never seen a reason that somebody should not have this turned on because I think it's useful for everyone in all cases. Let me show you what it looks like in case you haven't seen it. Within the Timesheets module, let me go here. Once you have it enabled, there's this new tab here called Time Entries. So essentially what it does is it breaks out each individual time entry into its own row in a list view so that you can run any kind of filters to say, show me all the time for X. So if you want to see all time against a particular project, that's what this view is showing right now. You can filter by client and then by project or just by client, however you want. And I can scroll to the bottom and see the total hours is 47.5. So for everybody. Well, what if I wanted to see, well, just by this task, there I go, 7.5. So you can do any kind of column filters, and then you can also do advanced filters. So I can create a new filter that says, show me all the time where the person is X and the project is X. Let me see, TimeType. Okay, apparently project isn't one of the available filters. I thought it was. But regardless, however you want to filter this, you can, in 99% of the cases, get to the data that you're looking for just by playing with the advanced filters or the column filters. And this saves you time in running detail reports, time entry detail reports. So it's just a nice feature. If you don't have this turned on already, just contact OpenAir support and request that the Time Entries tab be enabled for you. Oh yeah, quick note. Originally, when they released this a couple years ago, the intent was to track subcontractor time against invoices for reconciliation. So there's actually a thing that you can do. It's not really part of our topic today, but you can add custom fields on time entry, and then you can mark these time entries as paid or not. So when you get an invoice from a contractor, you can review it against, okay, well, show me all of them for this particular contractor, Charlie January. Does the invoice match this? If yes, then if you set it up right, you can actually mark this time entry as paid and actually add the invoice number. So for contractor payment reconciliation, it's really a cool little trick, and that's the reason that they implemented it in the first place. If you don't want everybody to have access to that, you can limit it by role. All right, that's a screenshot of what we were just looking at. All right, there's a few per project settings that, again, a lot of people are not aware of. These are those infamous internal switches that if you didn't hear about them in your implementation, you probably never did hear about them. But here's the idea. So on a per project basis, we've already talked about the ability to limit time types. But you can also restrict time entry per project. So rather than having to mark the project inactive, you can add a custom checkbox that says allow time entry. So if you're just setting up a project, it's active, but you don't want people to start entering time against it because it's not really set up correctly. You can just keep the checkbox unchecked until it's fully set up, and then check the box, and then that allows it to show up in people's timesheets. So it's a nice little added control if you just want to lock down a project in a really simple way. There's another one that I've seen a lot of people use, which is to conditionally require notes. So if you only want to require notes on some projects and not others, maybe your clients require detailed notes, and you want to enforce it for those projects but not for every project throughout the system. Again, you can create a custom checkbox, add it to the project, call it whatever you like, notes required, and then any time entries against that project, notes are going to be required. You can't save or submit the timesheet unless notes are on those time entries. Nice little feature. There's a few steps in setting this up. You just want to coordinate with OpenAir support because they've got to basically mark the name of the custom field on the back end so that they know which custom field that you've created actually controls this. So not difficult. Just reach out to them and they can walk you through it if you need to. All right, let's talk about approvals. So most people are aware that approval processes exist, and I see probably most of my clients using approval processes in one way or another. But if you haven't reviewed them in some time, you may not be aware of all of the different features that are available. They're actually pretty flexible. So we're going to step through some of these cool features. The first one, let's talk about sequence and how that works. So the most common scenario we see for this is a first one approval. So if you have a group that needs to approve timesheets, maybe the final approver of all timesheets might be finance or some operations group. But you don't necessarily care which person in that group approves it first as long as one of them does. We call that first one approval. You can do that. So let me jump into the approvals. Under Administration, Application Settings, Timesheet Settings, you'll see the approval processes. And I have one called Example here. So in this example, I have a sequence number of 1 for these first 2 people. So in this example, either the manager or the project owner can approve, and that will count as the first level of approval. And that's because I've checked this box down here. A sequence number requires only 1 approval. So what does this mean? You submit a timesheet. Both of these people, whoever they are in this sequence, are notified, hey, there's a timesheet ready for your approval. The reason they're both notified at once is because they have the same sequence number. As soon as one or the other approves it, then it goes on to this third sequence number. Could be 2 actually. Doesn't have to be 3. Then this project approver 1, which I'll talk about in a second, would be notified and down the list. So the notifications occur one after another based on sequence number. Options to designate alternate approver is self-approving. So if you, let's say the manager you want to, the project owner, you want to be the first approver. But let's say you don't want the project owner to approve their own timesheet. And you can say, if project owner is submitting it, don't let them approve it, route it to their manager instead. So that prevents them from ever approving their own timesheet without somebody else reviewing it. You can do that here on a line item basis, or you can do it for the whole thing. You can define selectively. Maybe you don't want the project owner to be able to edit it, but you want somebody else to be able to modify it if you have that enabled in your account. There is a feature that allows you to modify submitted timesheets. And the next thing that I think is really cool is assign after a certain number of days. Karen, I see you have a hand raised. I'll unmute you in just a second. Let me get through this, and then I'll have you ask your question. Assign after a number of days is basically an auto-escalation. So in this example, if you say that either Robert, August, or the project owner can approve, then you can say If somebody doesn't approve it within a certain number of days, then send it to the next person. So that's what this looks like. So we're saying that by default, we're actually sending this to Robert. It's just going to go to Robert. But if Robert doesn't approve it within 2 days, that's what this is here, then send it to the project owner. So it's kind of a way to escalate. Hey, don't let the timesheet sit for too long without being approved, and you can manage it that way. So let me see if I can figure out how to make this work, Karen, and have you ask your question. Okay, I see your question here. So you asked, when 2 people can approve, how do they know the other person already approved the timesheet? Good question. So essentially, they don't really know, but there's no alert that tells them, hey, you're off the hook, you don't have to approve this anymore. But when they click on that email link to go approve, and it takes them right to that timesheet, then it will just show that it's already approved. So the only way they'll actually know is when they go in to approve it and they see, this is already approved. They won't have the ability to approve it at that point. Okay. So additional project-specific approvers. This is a pretty cool feature. Again, not a lot of people know about it. But if you say that, you know what, it just depends on the project. Maybe you have an account manager per client that wants to review timesheets for all the time entered against their client projects. But they're not really the project owner. They're not anybody's manager necessarily, but you want them to be able to see time as it's submitted. You can specify project-specific approvers on the project. Let me show you what that looks like. So notice I have this project approver 1 here. The reason that shows up is because, again, it's an internal switch. You have to have it enabled. But what it looks like is when you go to the project, there is this separate list of approvers. Apparently, I have them hidden on my form permissions. But the same way that you define approvers on the project normally, there would be a separate list of project approver 1, approver 2, approver 3, and you can rename those approvers. So maybe you want to rename project approver 1 account manager. So then you just add account manager in whichever approval process you want, and then you can define on a per project basis who is the account manager for this project. So when you turn this on, by default you get all 3. You get project approver 1, 2, and 3. You can't just turn on one of them, but you can just hide them. As you can see, it's hidden in my account. Just hide the ones that you're not using, rename the ones that you are if you need to, and that's a nice little feature. Oh yeah, almost forgot this. I usually do forget this. If an approval process has an approver field that is blank, it will auto-approve. So if this is blank, that means auto-approve. So effectively, this is really just only Robert would approve this. So just keep that in mind. It won't give you an error or anything like that. It'll just select means auto-approve. Okay, approvers. Oh, this is what it looks like. Good. So this is a quick screenshot of the project approver 1, 2, and 3. And actually, I skipped around a little bit. It looks like I already covered automatic rerouting after a defined number of days. And we covered all that. Okay, so here's a situation. I used to see this a lot years ago. I don't really see this so much anymore because if you have the system, if you've gotten the system turned on within the last couple of years, they preset it this way to cover this. It used to be a common problem where people would get multiple alerts, multiple requests for approval on the same timesheet. Because if you're listed on the approval more than once in the approval process, let's say you're somebody's manager and you're the project owner, you approve it as their manager, and then the next step says, okay, now route it to the project owner for approval. You would actually generate an email to yourself again. You would have to approve it again as that second role. So there's an internal switch that basically says once you approve it once, then that counts as all of your approvals if you would normally approve it more than one time. The trick is that means that when you approve it, you're approving everything, the entire timesheet. Okay, line item rejection for individual time entry. So this is, I don't want to say this is good or bad. I see probably maybe 10% of our customers using this. If you have a use for it, it's probably because you have different regions operating at different billing schedules. So especially for those companies that have monthly timesheets or semi-monthly or have an issue getting time approved in different regions. But here's the scenario. I've submitted a timesheet and it's been approved by everyone except one person who doesn't want to approve it until they get client approval. So the entire timesheet is not approved, even though we're really just maybe waiting on one particular line item. So you can end up holding billing in that case, holding up billing. So there's this feature that allows you to approve or reject time on a line item basis. So it would look like this. I would say, yes, I reject this first time entry until further notice, but I'm going to approve all these others. You have to actually reject time entries. You can't say wait or leave submitted. It's reject or approve. And then you can decide, well, first what happens is it creates a fragmented or a separate timesheet for all the rejected line items. So you have an approved timesheet. All the stuff that's good can go ahead and be processed for billing. And then all the stuff that's held up becomes a rejected timesheet. The person has to resubmit it, or you could proxy in as resubmit if you wanted to, until you get whatever approval or changes made to those rejected timesheets. Then the question is, what do you want to do with that rejected timesheet once it's approved? You can either, what I see most people do, merge it back into the original timesheet and all the approval history so it looks historically as if they were never split. Or you can keep them separate with separate approval histories. And the name of the timesheet, though, just becomes rejected time entries. So you would just keep the split timesheets. If you want to rejoin the timesheet, then the entire timesheet as a whole has to be reapproved. All right, almost out of time here, so I'll go through a couple of these final thoughts. Overlapping timesheets. The month-end challenge is a challenge for, I would say, most companies that I work with. The end of the month falls on a Wednesday. You want to be able to bill time through Wednesday, but if people enter their time through Wednesday, then Thursday and Friday aren't populated. How do you do that? Do you ask people to submit an early timesheet? Do you ask them to guess time for Thursday, Friday, and then fix it later? Well, there are a set of features that you should consider if this is a challenge for you still. You can set a couple different internal switches that will allow you flexibility depending on how you want it to work. So the first switch is prevent time on a single timesheet from being in more than 1 month. So that just says if Wednesday is the last day of the month, then Thursday and Friday are grayed out. I can't actually enter time on those days. I'm going to skip ahead and show you this is what that looks like. So the top picture shows I've entered time Monday through Thursday, but Friday, Saturday, Sunday I actually can't. They're blocked out. And then when you create a new timesheet, you would create an overlapping timesheet for the same week, the 28th through the 3rd in this example. But now because of that switch, you can't enter time against more than 1 month, so now you're entering time against April, the next month, and you see the previous month's days grayed out. So that's the first control. But sometimes this can actually create confusion because depending on how you do it, you can accidentally toggle back to the old timesheet. So I see problems where people say, I've created an overlapping timesheet, but it's just showing the same days that I've already entered. How do I get it to show just the first through the third in this example? Well, actually, if you scroll down on this timesheet enter time form, you would see there's a little link there that says toggle to show time from March or show time from April. So you can actually switch it back and forth before you've entered time. All right, that's what I covered there. There's another switch that you can do that will actually prevent you from entering time on the same day on two different timesheets. So if you've already entered time on the 31st and you create an overlapping timesheet, the 31st is automatically going to be grayed out because you've already entered time on that day. It won't allow it on two different timesheets. So different combinations of these may or may not make sense for you. And I think the last thing we're going to cover is timesheet adjustment. If you aren't aware of this, it allows you to automatically create an overlapping timesheet that only just corrects the other timesheet. So if you haven't used this, it's a really handy feature. It prevents you from having to reject time, which can be a hassle if time has already been billed, because you can't reject timesheets if the time has been billed. And it just says, let me see if I have an example here. This is what it looks like. You go in and you adjust the timesheet. It looks like a copy of the existing timesheet, but you only just change whatever you want to change. So you change hours from one project to another or change the number of hours. And then the resulting timesheet gets named with the same name and it adds adjusted. You can see in the screenshot down below to the name. And then the only thing it does is it has negative entries from one project and positive entries to the other. So it essentially has the effect of taking hours from one place and adding them to another place, whether that's just based on number of hours or different task, different project. And then you end up in your timesheet list seeing two different timesheets for that week for that user. Just keep in mind when you're using this, the adjusting transactions get billed along with the original transactions. So it's going to bill the time from the original timesheet, and then it's going to bill the negative time from the adjusting timesheet. So you end up with more billing transactions and charges than you would normally end up with. So you've just got to understand why that's happening when you're creating your invoices. All right, and to conclude, pretty much everybody uses timesheets, but it's always a good idea to understand what options are out there so that you know, maybe I could be using the system a little bit better and reducing my risk and the mistakes in data and so forth. So please, if you have any questions about this, I'm going to open it up in just a second for general questions. But if you want to talk in greater detail or follow up with us, this is what we do. If you're not familiar with TopStep, our whole business is based on professional services operations. So we come from industry. Our background is actually doing your jobs, and we've used OpenAir to do your job. So we know what it's like to use the system to improve efficiency as well as to be frustrated with the system, and we know its limitations and primarily what makes sense to support your business process. So this is us. Reach out to us if you'd like.